Hello, fellow history buffs and Taphophiles. In the first video in this mini-series, I mentioned how questions on a census have changed since the inception in 1790. Today, let's dive deep into questions asked throughout the years together because some might surprise you. A census is the procedure of systematically acquiring, recording, and calculating population information about the members of a given population. The United States federal census takes place every 10 years since 1790 and sets out to count every person living in the United States and its territories. Now you might be wondering, with the most recent census just being in 2020, why can the public only access censuses up until 1950? Well, that's because the government introduced the 72-year rule in 1978, in which the government will not release personally identifiable information about an individual to any other individual or agency until 72 years after it was collected for the decennial census. After 72 years, the records are released to the public through the National Archives and Record Administration. We just got access to 1950 in 2022, so in 2032, we'll have access to the 1960 census. Now, with almost anything, the census has had its fair share of controversy. I won't go in too much detail about each controversy that it had, but it is no secret that census data does change and shift political power throughout the country and also gives chance for shifting of resources, not always for the better. Most recently, in 2018, the Secretary of Commerce at the time said that they would be adding a question to the census about a respondent's citizenship status, so that would have been added to 2020. Lawsuits followed, and eventually the Supreme Court did block that question from being added. But enough about the history. You are here because you want to know the questions asked throughout the years, which, fair enough. So without further ado, let's go year by year to find some unique questions. Picture this, 1790, the first federal census. It only had 4 questions. Well, 5 if you count asking who the head of the household was. Those 4 questions were number of free white males with 2 age brackets, number of free white females, number of other free persons in a household, and how many enslaved persons a household had. Now, I want you to keep in mind, asking who a head of household is a mainstay question for the census, and usually it is the oldest white male and or the owner of the property, so just keep that in mind. The 1800 census started the trend of recording a household's town, county, parish, or city of residence and added some more age brackets for free white males and females. 1810 had identical questions to 1800, but in addition to the typical population census, data was collected about the nation's manufacturing status. Manufactured products were broken into 25 broad categories and encompassed 220 kinds of goods. Census takers would go to manufacturing establishments and ask questions on quantity and value of manufactured goods. 1820 built on 1810 questions and added a 16 to 18 age bracket for males, added age brackets for slaves and freed colored men and women, also asked a question about number of foreigners not neutralized, and number of persons, including slaves, engaged in agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing. In 1830, age brackets were expanded, and we would first be introduced to a question on if a person was deaf, dumb, or blind. 1840 was the introduction of a question around if someone was considered insane or idiotic, along with if a person is deaf, dumb, or blind. Name and age of pensioners for revolutionary or military service popped up, a question around what type of industry each working age person was part of, and the first question around what type of schooling everyone in a household had was first introduced. The 1850 census was the first time we had everybody in a household listed by name, and this is huge for genealogists. There was a separate questionnaire for slave inhabitants that unfortunately did not break down each enslaved person by name, but did include questions on how many uncaught slaves escaped in the past year and how many slaves were free from bondage in the past year. The 1860 census was very similar to this one. With slavery officially being abolished and the 13th Amendment being formed in December 1865, the 1870 census did away with the slave inhabitant questionnaire, and finally everybody in the US could fill out the same census and list names, age, race, and gender. This is also the first census that would ask if a person's parents were foreign born, and if each male in a household 21 or over was a US citizen, and if that male citizen had their right to vote revoked. 1880 gave us a question on relationship to the head of household, because head of household was still being noted and usually was the property owner and or the oldest male in the household. This question is really helpful to know if someone was just a boarder in a house, like a temporary living situation, if it was a mother-in-law that moved in with her daughter and her daughter's husband, or what have you. Additionally, instead of asking if someone was deaf, dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic in a single question, it was broken up into multiple questions, and we also saw a question on if someone was considered crippled, maimed, or otherwise disabled to try to get a more fuller picture of everyone in the US. 1890 was very similar to 1880 with a little bit of a layout difference. It also added additional distinguishments for East Asian races under the race question, and we also saw questions surrounding if a home was owned and mortgage-free. The 1900 and 1910 censuses were very similar. They both had a separate Indian population schedule for census takers to ask indigenous people living on a reservation. The first 28 questions asked to these people were about the same as the general population census, but questions 29 through 38 were targeted for the specific demographic. Questions on this included the name of a person's tribe, if a person was taxed, or if a person's house was considered movable or fixed. The 1910 general census asked a handful more questions than 1900, like is the person a survivor of the Union or Confederate Army or Navy? 1920 did not have a separate Indian population schedule, and also made some other minor changes, like using the term abode rather than dwelling house when asking a person's residence. Interestingly, the 1930 census sort of brought back the Indian population schedule, just with a different name and some different questions. On top of that, this census changed up the race classification a bit and had a separate census of unemployment questionnaire that was rather lengthy, and for the last question, reasons for being out of a job, census takers were asked to get extremely specific answers. Obviously, this additional questionnaire was to gauge the effects on the workforce during the Great Depression, which had just started. 1940 brought big changes to the census. The census itself was broken into two questionnaires, one for population data and one for housing data. It also introduced the use of sampling and statistics, where 5% of the population were given 16 additional questions. Asking a sample size certain questions became a mainstay in censuses for years to come, and the separate housing questionnaire was used to gauge the Great Depression's effect on the nation's housing stock, but we would see this separate questionnaire until the 1990s. 1950, while similar to 1940, asked fewer questions, only 20, but did continue the statistical sampling, and 20% of the population were asked questions 21 through 33, and 3.5% were asked questions 34 through 38. 1960 was the first time urban neighborhoods were mailed the census and told to fill it out prior to a census taker coming to collect, while rural neighborhoods were still visited by census takers like normal. This was also the first census that we would see a question on what mode of transport someone took to get to work. And in 1970, they did away with census takers completely, mailing census forms to everyone in the US, expecting them to mail it back. Enumerators were only sent out if someone did not mail back their form. In this census, they continued to play a little bit with sampling. The first 8 questions were asked to everyone, while question 9 through 41 were asked to 5, 15, or 20% of residents. I also found it interesting that the question around how many babies a woman had was rewritten to read girl or woman. The 1980 census did change that wording to just read female. While on the topic of the 80s, it was very similar to the 1970s, with the housing questionnaire being just a little bit different. The extra questions asked to the sample population were if a person's home or building was connected to public sewer, and the cost of electricity, gas, water, and any other means of heat like oil or coal. 1990 was the last true separate housing questionnaire. The main census only had 7 questions for each questionnaire. A sample population was asked an additional 25 population questions and 19 additional housing questions. One of the additional population questions asked was, what was this person's total income in 1989? The 2000s short form census was a breezy 8 questions, but the long form that incorporated both housing and population and was asked to a sample size had an additional 45 questions. Some questions on the long form were, what location did this person work last week, and how many automobiles, vans, and trucks were kept at a home and used by members of the household. And lastly, in 2010, things changed up a little bit. There was no short form or long form and no more sampling, and it was condensed down to 10 questions. Now, as you can see, these questions were nothing out of the ordinary. But how do we get data that the long form questionnaires gave to us? We're still able to get information on housing, occupation, and education from an ongoing survey called the American Community Survey. This is an ongoing survey sent out to a rotating sample population every year. The ACS is part of the Census Bureau, but it is a little bit different. The survey is sent to the 50 states, DC, and Puerto Rico, while the normal census is mailed to the 50 states, DC, and all 5 major US territories. The census is also just a population count to help determine congressional representation, while the ACS data gathered every year is helping local and national leaders better understand local needs to programs, economic development, and local issues. Thank you so much for joining me today and learning probably more than you wanted to about the US federal census. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and become part of the A.G.A family. Bye!